Good afternoon, and welcome to the Ayles Island Virtual Brewery Tour for a happy half hour. As I mentioned in my video earlier about doing this, I told you should grab a six-pack, maybe have a beer or six and a shot, and I'm gonna do the same thing. So welcome to our brew house. This is the beginning of our process for making beer. We're old school brewers here at Ayles Island. We started in 2006 and we moved into this building in 2012. We have state-of-the-art water filtration, milling, and brew house. We're one of the most efficient breweries in the entire country, and I'm gonna walk you through a few of our steps today. Like I said, we're old school brewers, and that means we use water, malt, yeast, and hops. We use Madison City water. It's shocking to some people, but it tastes great when we turn it into beer. And after filtering out and breaking down a calcium bicarbonate that's in the water, we run it into our brew house. After we take care of the milling, we run that into our brew house. When we talk about milling and when we talk about malt, we mean wheat, malted wheat. Sometimes oats, a couple of other things, but for the most part, malted wheat. And depending on what they do to it, it can be really, really dark or really, really light or anywhere in between. We have three 50,000-pound silos outside, and generally we go through one silo a week. We make about 25,000 barrels of beer a year through this very room. So once it's crushed, once it's milled, we call it grist. And it goes into the giant silo here, the grist silo, and we drop it into our mash tun, the first vessel that we have here. It's just a giant tank that we have hot water in. We spray the grist as it goes in to keep it from clumping, and it steeps in there for about an hour. What we're trying to do is break down that malt and extract all of the sugars out of it. The sugars are what we're going to use for fermentation later in the process. Once it's in there and it's steeped for about an hour, it essentially looks like oatmeal. We transfer all of that into our lauter tun. The lauter tun doesn't go down as far, it has a false bottom on it. The lauter tun is a separation vessel where we're going to separate the solids and the liquids. We're making wort in here. It's what brewers call unfermented beer, or the hot sugar water. We percolate the liquid over itself to extract as many of the sugars out as we can to get the gravity where we want it so that the beer is the right alcohol content later, and you get all of the tasty goodness out of it. We transfer the liquid into the boil vessel here, and we transfer all of the spent grain out into another room. We donate that grain to local area farmers. Here, the boil kettle, we have to get the liquid boiling, and there's three ways to do that in a production facility. The oldest and crudest is a direct fire. We've all been camping a lot more lately than we have been. We didn't do that. It's not very efficient. The next way is a steam jacket. They put a jacket around the entire vessel and they pump steam around it, and it heats it from the outside in. Again, not very efficient. We put in a calandria. It's the big 1 foot tube there on the right. It's not very exciting to look at, but if you were to cut it open and look inside, you'd see 26 1-inch tubes. Each of those 1-inch tubes is surrounded by steam. We pull the wort off the bottom, run it up through the calandria, and then over the china hat you saw inside here, and we can get 33 barrels of liquid. That's nearly 1,000 gallons a batch, boiling in about 9 minutes. It's 85% more efficient than the direct fire. It's 65% more efficient than the steam jacket. It creates shorter brew days, which our brewers love. It creates more efficient brewing, which our brewmaster loves, and they can make a lot more beer, which I love. The boil kettle is also when we're gonna add hops. Hops, the third ingredient, they look like little green pine cones, but really they're little green flowers. And that's the spice of your beer to counteract the malty sweetness from the malt earlier. All beer has water, malt, hops, and we'll talk about yeast in a minute in it, to get the type of beer that you like, from the lightest, crispest pilsners and lagers, kolsches, to the big, heavy, malty porters, stouts, Diablo, our Belgian double, all sorts of them. has all 4 ingredients in it. So this is where we add hops, and depending when you add the hops, the type of hops, how many hops you add, even using the same variety of hops, you can get a bunch of different flavor profiles out of it. After it's done with the boil process, we transfer it over to our 4th vessel. Our 4th vessel is a whirlpool, and it's exactly what you think. It swirls the wort around at an angle, and it separates the solid hop particulates from the liquid wort that the brewmaster and brewers have been working so hard on making in here. And we send cleaner wort to fermentation. For some of our beers, we send them through our 5th vessel, which is a unique vessel made for us by the Sprinkman Corporation, the company that made our brew house here in Wisconsin. It is a stripper, it's a chemical stripper, and we use an inert gas, nitrogen in this case, to strip a chemical compound out. Because we only use water, malt, yeast, and hops in our beer, it's about letting the ingredients shine. We're not gonna cover it up with a bunch of stuff later. We want you to taste the beer the way that it should be, the way that we make it, the old way, the hard way, as our brewmaster Dean would say. After it's all done in the brew house here, we send it through a heat frame plate exchanger, which is right below us now. So it creates hot water from the hot wort that ends up in the next batch of beer, next batch of wort, so we get to use that energy twice. And we send cooler wort to fermentation so we don't kill any of our yeast cells. Let's go to fermentation. Oh look, another beer. Very good. So we're in the brewery now, or we're in the fermentation and conditioning piece of our brewery. It's a little bit louder in here. Hopefully you can all hear me. Forgive me for the noise. We'll answer any questions you have later. But here we're talking about fermentation. Every one of the angled vessels behind me are our fermenters. From our small 15-barrel fermenters to our 400-barrel fermenter, which houses over 5,000 cases of Hopalicious in it most of the time. The easiest way to talk about fermentation is to begin at the end of the last cycle. At the end of the last cycle, once it's done converting wort into beer, brewers make wort, yeast makes beer. The yeast cells, the fungus cells, Saccharomyces, have eaten all of the sugar, converted all of it into alcohols. It settles. We crash the tank, which means changing it from its fermentation temperature to its conditioning temperature, and we'll move it over to the other side. We then test the yeast. We have a lab in the center of our brewery. They do all sorts of tests, but yeast propagation rates, yeast health rates, genetic drift. If you want the same beer going out the back door, you have to have the same process going through. Making beer is not that hard. Making the same beer twice is really, really hard. So here we have 4 times as much yeast as we did. We test it, it's good. We put it back in, it's settled down, and then we bring the wort from the brew house into here and we pitch it into the fermenter. 3 things begin to happen. It's a biological process. It creates a lot of heat as it's converting those sugars into alcohol. Yay, alcohol. All alcohol comes from yeast fermentation. It creates CO2 naturally. All of your beer is naturally carbonated. And then the third thing I said is it creates a lot of heat. Each of our fermenters have these gauges, these white gauges and tubes all around them, because each fermenter has a glycol jacket where there's a food-grade glycol running around the outside to manage the temperature of fermentation. You're able to manipulate the esters and some of the flavors that you get in your final product by fermentation temperatures. Again, even using the same yeast strain, you can get different flavors depending on how you make it work for you. We manage 6 or 7 different yeast strains here consistently and have many more than that in our year-round calendar. The last thing about each of the fermenters is they all have a manway on the top there. That's what that big latch system there is called. And you can open that up to dump hops into it. That's referred to as dry hopping. So all of your hop-forward beers, APAs, IPAs, double IPAs, the pale ales for the most part, and in a happy accident, Ambergeddon, our West Coast amber, are all dry hopped. It's good for the hoppy flavor because 60% of what you taste comes from what you smell. For hops, the earlier you add them in the process, the more it's done for bittering effects. The later you add them in the process, the more it's done for those aromatics, the softness, the juicy, the flowery, and all of that. So we're gonna move over to conditioning. If you have questions on fermentation, throw them in the comments there. We'll make sure we get back to you. So here we are at conditioning and kegging. Once the beer is in the fermenters, and they'll live in there for about a week if it's an ale, several weeks if it's a lager, they move over to conditioning because alcohol needs to age. All alcohol needs to age. And they're generally in the conditioning vessels here for the same amount of time that they're in the fermenters on the front end. It takes about 2 weeks to make an ale. It takes about 2 months to make a lager. Some can be done faster. It all really depends on the alcohol content and what you're trying to get. Once the beer has been through fermentation and conditioning, we're able to put it into packaging. We do all sorts of packaging here at Ale Asylum. We keg, we can, and we bottle. I get asked from time to time, does it taste better from a can, a bottle, or a keg? And the real answer is good beer comes from good packaging and bad beer comes in bad packaging. If you have kegged beer, you've gone to a bar, not now, stay at home, but you've enjoyed a beer and you thought, I'm gonna go get a 6-pack. You get a 6-pack of bottles because you think bottles are better. Or you get a 6-pack of cans because cans are better. You're both right, you're both wrong. It's good beer comes in good packaging. It's how you drink it. Beer should really be poured into a glass to let the head out, to give you the smell, so that you can get the full effect of it. Today, I'm drinking canned beer because I happen to like it. But our kegger is a great example of how automation has helped us out. At our old facility on the other side of MATC, it took 2 really young, motivated people about an hour to wash, sanitize, and fill 9 kegs. Here, one person with no heavy lifting can fill almost 35 an hour through our system. The other parts that we do are bottling and canning. Come this way. And we're ready. Right now, we've adjusted our business model a little bit. We're no longer kegging beer because there's no bars or restaurants open that can really do a lot of on-premise service. So we've switched and did several weeks ago to canning and bottling to make sure all of our favorite retail locations here locally have all of the Ale Asylum that you guys are asking for, that you need, and we appreciate the support right now. I might need this. This is our canning line. It's one of the most important machines in our entire building. We're able to do 16-ounce cans, we're able to do 12-ounce cans, and it operates at about 180 cans a minute. So the way that it works is very similar to the way the canning line works. Each of them has a depalletizer. So you put a pallet of those big cans or the bottles into the system at the front end. You can see the big gray box here. And it lifts it up from the bottom and it sweeps one row off at a time. The bottling line does the exact same thing in a little bit longer process. The bottling line runs at 288 bottles a minute. As it runs along the back end of the system, it does nothing more than get it into a single file line so that they can be turned over. Even though they're new, even though they're clean, we want to make sure that they're sanitized. So we sanitize and rinse every can and every bottle before we put beer into it. Each system then has a head filler. So the bottle or the can runs into the canner here, or the bottling line on the far end of the brewery, and each one of them is then sealed at the top end. The bottling line actually vacuums the atmosphere out and replaces it with CO2. Bottles are clean, bottles are empty, but they're full of the atmosphere. Oxygen is the death of beer. We talked about a minute ago, good beer comes in good packaging, bad beer comes in bad packaging, and packaging with oxygen is bad packaging. So our bottling line grabs the top of the bottle, vacuums the atmosphere out, and replaces it with CO2 before beer is put in. Our canning line is very similar, with the exception that you can't vacuum the atmosphere out of cans because you'll implode them, like the cans I've been squeezing all along the tour. Here, we have a doser. We use liquid nitrogen, and we use 1/10 of a gram per can. It hits the bottom of the can, it turns into gas, and it displaces the atmosphere. It looks like a bunch of choo-choo train stacks that then get sealed and filled, again, at about 180 cans a minute. As the cans roll through, or the bottles roll through, they're inspected. They're inspected for different things. They're inspected for volume to make sure the right amount is in there. They're inspected for pinholes. They're inspected for crumples. They're inspected for several different things along the way to make sure that the beer in the can and the vessel bringing it to you are of the highest quality possible. We wanted to make sure throughout the entire tour and throughout our entire tenure of making beer that we're giving the best beer we can to our consumers. If you've enjoyed watching the video, if you've enjoyed having a couple of beers with me this afternoon, we're going to be reopened again on Friday of this week from 3 to 8 for carry-out beer, 3 to 7 for carry-out beer, and then we're going to be open again next week for carry-out food. We've been developing several processes to ensure the safety of our staff, the safety of our consumers, and the safety of our community. We appreciate you during these times. I hope you've enjoyed the tour. I hope you've enjoyed a couple of beers with me. Salud.